In the grand, tragic theater of American history, some figures stand so brightly in the spotlight that they cast long shadows. And in those shadows, other lives are lived, lives of fierce loyalty, quiet strength, and unimaginable pain. We think we know the Kennedy story, the soaring ambition, the shocking violence, the so-called curse that haunted its golden generation. But what if the keeper of that story, its most resilient heart, was someone who rarely sought the microphone, yet whose life speaks volumes about the cost of that legacy? This isn't the story of a politician or a president. It's the story of a woman who built a world of joyful, chaotic love and then had to learn how to live in it alone. A woman who hosted the most vibrant parties in Washington, who raised 11 children, who knelt beside her husband as he lay dying on a cold pantry floor, and who then got up day after day for the next 50 years. This is the story of Ethel Skakel Kennedy, the unbreakable matriarch who witnessed the fall of Camelot and spent a lifetime tending to its complicated and often heartbreaking legacy. How does a person endure the unendurable? And what does a life shaped by both immense privilege and profound loss ultimately teach us about the nature of faith, family, and survival? To truly understand Ethel, you must first understand that she was not born a Kennedy. She was forged in a different fire. Born in Chicago in 1928 and raised in the affluent suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, Ethel Skakel grew up in a world that existed in the shadow of the Great Depression and on the cusp of a world war. While Greenwich was home to America's elite, the Skakels were not old money. They were something brasher, richer, and in the eyes of the established families, far less refined. Her father, George Skakel, was a force of nature, a brilliant, tempestuous, self-made titan. The son of a bricklayer, he started as a railroad clerk, and through sheer grit and business acumen, built the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation into a colossal fortune. He was known to be a demanding boss and an even more demanding father, a man who expected his children to be tough, competitive, and fearless. The Skakel household on the grand estate of Admiralty was governed by two powerful and competing forces: George's relentless secular ambition and his wife Anne's fervent, almost severe, Catholic faith. Anne Branagh Skakel was a woman of deep, unwavering piety. She ensured the home ran on a strict schedule of daily mass, rosaries, and religious instruction. This potent combination of her father's grit and her mother's piety became the bedrock of Ethel's character. From George, she inherited a scrappy, competitive spirit and a love for sport. She was taught to sail, ride horses, and hit a tennis ball with ferocious intensity. From Anne, she inherited a profound faith that would become her armor in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The Skakel home was a whirlwind of noise, activity, and 7 children. It was far less formal than the Kennedy household in Boston. It was a place of loud dinners, practical jokes, and a general air of boisterous chaos. But it was also a place acquainted with tragedy early on. This part of Ethel's story is often overlooked, but it's crucial. She learned about loss long before she became a Kennedy. In 1955, her parents, George and Anne, were killed in a horrific plane crash in Oklahoma. Just over a decade later, her older brother, George Skakel Jr., who had taken over the family business, also died in a private plane crash. This background of sudden, violent loss instilled in her a kind of fatalistic resilience. It was as if she learned from a young age that life was precarious, and the only response was to live it fully and lean on faith when the worst inevitably happened. Ethel was sent to the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York, a prestigious finishing school for wealthy Catholic girls. It was here that her world was destined to collide with the Kennedys. Her roommate and close friend was Jean Kennedy, the youngest daughter of the powerful Boston clan. During a ski trip to Mont Tremblant in Quebec in the winter of 1945, Jean invited her brother along. It wasn't the charismatic future president, Jack, who would capture Ethel's heart for long, though they did date briefly. Instead, it was Jean's other brother, the one who stood in the shadows, Robert Francis Kennedy. Bobby at the time was painfully shy, intensely serious, and often consumed by a sense of duty and a quiet melancholy. He was the seventh of 9 children, struggling to find his place among his more dazzling older brothers. Ethel Skakel was his opposite in almost every way. She was exuberant, endlessly energetic, and possessed a mischievous, teasing wit. She was utterly unpretentious, a force of nature who seemed to have no filter. It was this raw authenticity that captivated Bobby. Friends from that era recalled that Ethel was one of the only people who could genuinely make him laugh, who could pierce through his reserved exterior and draw out the playful, warm-hearted young man hidden within. Their courtship was not a story of love at first sight. It was a slow, steady burn built on a foundation of deeply shared values. He was drawn to her vitality and saw in her a partner who could build the large, boisterous family he dreamed of. She saw beneath his often stern demeanor to the core of his sensitivity and moral conviction. They were both devout Catholics, both fiercely competitive on the tennis court or in a sailing race, and both believed in the primacy of family. When they married on a sunny day in June of 1950 at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich, it was more than a society wedding. It was the union of 2 people who completed each other. The quiet, introspective Kennedy had found his extroverted, life-affirming counterpart. Ethel was now a Kennedy, but she would never stop being a Skakel. She would simply inject that irrepressible energy into the heart of her new family, creating a world all her own. That world found its capital at Hickory Hill. In 1957, after Bobby had purchased the sprawling white brick estate in McLean, Virginia, from his brother Jack, the property underwent a radical transformation. Under Jackie Kennedy's brief tenure, the home had been a place of elegant, refined French taste. Under Ethel's command, it became what one journalist famously called a perpetual state of controlled chaos. Hickory Hill was the vibrant, noisy, beating heart of the new frontier. It was less a formal political salon and more a combination of summer camp, zoo, and community center. The stories from this era are legendary. Ethel presided over a menagerie of pets that would astound a small zoo. There were at least a half-dozen dogs, cats, flocks of birds, ponies, and famously, a seal named Sandy, who would occasionally find his way into the family's swimming pool. The home was constantly overflowing with children, her own, which would eventually number 11, and dozens of their friends and cousins. Ethel's parenting philosophy was a direct inheritance from her Skakel upbringing, a blend of love, faith, and a near-total lack of rules. The children were encouraged to be tough, to play hard, and to explore. Hickory Hill's lawn was the site of the now famous Kennedy touch football games, which were played with the ferocity of a championship match. Dignitaries, senators, and journalists would arrive for a meeting with the Attorney General and find themselves drafted into a game, often ending up bruised and mud-stained. Ethel herself was a formidable player. The historian and Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. once recalled being unceremoniously shoved into the swimming pool by Ethel during a particularly boisterous party. It was all part of the experience. She created an environment that was deliberately informal, a place where Bobby could decompress from the immense pressures of his job as Attorney General. While Jackie Kennedy was the epitome of curated elegance in the White House, Ethel was the authentic, down-to-earth face of the administration's inner circle. She was a natural on the campaign trail, able to connect with voters with a warmth and spontaneity that was all her own. She remembered names, told jokes, and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She was Bobby's greatest champion, his fiercest defender, and his most trusted confidant. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world held its breath, Ethel gathered the children and steadfastly remained in Washington, a quiet signal of her faith in her husband and her brother-in-law. But this idyllic, chaotic world was built on the fragile foundations of political power, and in November 1963, that foundation was shattered. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas plunged the family, and especially Bobby, into a deep, dark abyss of grief. Bobby was not just mourning a brother. He was mourning his leader, his hero, the center of his universe. He became a ghost, gaunt and haunted, retreating into a silent world of pain. In this dark chapter, Ethel's role shifted. She became his lifeline. Understanding that words were useless, she fought to keep him tethered to the world of the living. She did it not by dwelling on the tragedy, but by insisting on a defiant normalcy. She kept Hickory Hill brimming with life. She organized games, encouraged the children's noisy play, and made sure their home remained a sanctuary of vitality, not a somber monument to death. Friends recalled that she was relentless in her efforts, practically dragging Bobby out of his room to engage with his children, to feel the sun on his face, to be reminded of what was still worth fighting for. It was an act of profound love and psychological endurance. Slowly, painfully, Bobby began to emerge from his grief. His sorrow sharpened into a profound sense of purpose, a moral conviction that he now had to carry his brother's torch. He ran for the Senate in New York and won, and in the Senate, he became a passionate, eloquent voice for the poor, the disenfranchised, and those left behind by society. Ethel was there every step of the way, organizing, campaigning, and believing. When he finally made the momentous decision to run for president in the tumultuous spring of 1968, it felt less like an act of ambition and more like an act of destiny. The campaign was a crusade, a passionate, often chaotic movement to heal a nation being torn apart by the Vietnam War, racial injustice, and generational divides. Ethel, then pregnant with their 11th child, was a whirlwind of energy at his side, a constant, smiling symbol of hope. On the night of June 4th, 1968, that hope seemed on the verge of becoming reality. Bobby had just won the crucial California Democratic primary, a victory that put him on a clear path to the nomination. After delivering a soaring victory speech to a jubilant crowd at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he decided to take a shortcut through a crowded kitchen pantry to meet with the press. Ethel, waiting for him just a few steps away in the press area, heard a series of sharp, popping sounds. For a split second, she thought they were balloons or flashbulbs. Then came the screams. What happened next is a scene of almost unimaginable horror, a national tragedy that played out in a grimy, industrial kitchen. Ethel rushed towards the sound and saw her husband crumpled on the cold concrete floor. A busboy had placed a rosary in his hand. His eyes were open, but they were unseeing. In that moment of pure chaos and terror, surrounded by shouting, panicked people, Ethel's first instinct was one of profound, protective love. Eyewitnesses, including the writer George Plimpton, described how she immediately took control. She dropped to her knees, cradled Bobby's head, and whispered to him. She became a human shield, fiercely telling the crowd, "Give him air, give him room." She was protecting the last sacred moments of his life from the prying eyes of the world. She rode with him in the ambulance, never letting go of his hand, her simple print dress stained with his blood. For the next 26 agonizing hours at the Good Samaritan Hospital, she kept a constant, unwavering vigil. She stood by his side as a team of surgeons performed a desperate, hopeless operation. She greeted the stream of family and friends who arrived, her face a mask of strained composure. She reportedly asked a priest who was praying over Bobby, "Is it possible he might not die?" A heartbreaking testament to her refusal to give up. When the doctors finally told her there was nothing more they could do, that the damage to his brain was catastrophic, she had to perform the most difficult act of her life. She had to say goodbye. Then she had to board Air Force Two, the vice president's plane, to accompany her husband's body back across the country. On that long, silent flight, surrounded by grieving aides and family, she sat beside his coffin, a solitary, tragic figure. She was flying back to Hickory Hill, back to a home that was no longer a sanctuary of joy, but the scene of a second devastating chapter of grief. And she had to figure out how to tell her 10 waiting children that their father, their hero, was never coming home. In the immediate aftermath, Ethel seemed to encase herself in a shell of stoic grace. She planned the funeral, greeted thousands of mourners, and stood, veiled and composed, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. 6 months after Bobby's death, she gave birth to their 11th child, a daughter she named Rory Elizabeth Catherine. It was a bittersweet arrival, a new life born in the shadow of death, the only one of her children who would never know their father. In the months that followed, she made a quiet but firm decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not leave Hickory Hill. While many would have fled such a memory-laden place, Ethel chose to stay. She would raise her children in the house their father had loved, surrounded by the life they had built. She would not allow it to become a somber museum. The touch football games continued. The ponies still roamed the lawn. Her decision was an act of profound defiance against despair. But raising 11 children alone, under the glare of public scrutiny and the shadow of such a monumental loss, was a Herculean task. She was now a single parent to a tribe of grieving, energetic, and sometimes reckless children, all of whom were navigating their trauma in different ways. Her parenting style, that Skakel Kennedy blend of devout Catholicism and immense freedom, became both her anchor and a source of future difficulty. She insisted on nightly rosaries and regular attendance at Mass, instilling a deep and abiding sense of faith. But she also gave her children an almost boundless freedom, perhaps believing that fostering independence was the best way to build resilience. Hickory Hill remained a place of few rules. This environment, which some observers later termed benign neglect, was seen by critics as a recipe for trouble, a way of coping that left the children too unsupervised in a world filled with the immense temptations of wealth and fame. The weight of the Kennedy name, combined with their personal trauma, proved to be a heavy and at times fatal burden. The so-called Kennedy curse seemed to stalk her children. The first devastating blow came in 1984. Her 4th child, David, died of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel room. David had been just 12 years old when he watched his father's assassination on television, a trauma from which he never recovered. He had struggled with addiction for years, and his death was a heartbreaking echo of the violence that had shattered their family. Ethel was devastated, but her public response was one of stoic faith, a quiet retreat into her family and her religion. Then on New Year's Eve in 1997, tragedy struck again. Her 6th child, Michael, was killed in a reckless skiing accident in Aspen, where he collided with a tree while famously playing football on skis. He left behind a wife and young children. Each loss chipped away at the family, but Ethel refused to publicly crumble. Her response was always the same: to gather her remaining family around her, to pray, and to carry on. This relentless forward motion, this fierce refusal to be defined by victimhood, also led to some of the most complex and controversial moments in her life. The first came just a year after Bobby's death, with the scandal of Chappaquiddick. The party on that fateful night in July 1969, where a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne died after Senator Ted Kennedy drove a car off a bridge, was held for the Boiler Room Girls, the dedicated female staffers from Bobby's 1968 campaign. Ethel had co-hosted a party for them earlier in the day. While she was not on the island at the time of the accident, her close connection to the event and the shadow it cast over the family's reputation was another painful association with tragedy and its complicated aftermath. More personally, and perhaps more painfully, were the controversies that touched her own children's families. Her relationship with her daughter-in-law, Mary Richardson Kennedy, the wife of her son Robert F. Kennedy Jr., was reportedly deeply strained. When Mary, who battled depression and addiction amidst a contentious divorce, tragically took her own life in 2012, reports surfaced of Ethel's difficult and allegedly cold behavior in the aftermath. It was reported that Ethel had made her feel like an outsider, and after her death made decisions that excluded Mary's family. Critics painted her as a matriarch, whose loyalty to her own blood superseded all else, a woman whose fierce protectiveness could manifest as a chilling lack of compassion. It is impossible for any of us to truly judge the actions of a mother who had endured so much. Were these moments a reflection of a cold heart, or the defense mechanisms of a woman so battered by grief that her only survival instinct was to close ranks and protect her own, no matter the cost? The truth, as it often is, lies in the complex gray area in between. These controversies don't negate her strength. Rather, they reveal the profound human messiness of a life lived under impossible pressure. They show us a woman who was not a plaster saint, but a flawed, grieving, and ferociously loyal mother trying to navigate an ocean of pain. But to define Ethel Kennedy's life only by her tragedies and controversies is to miss the most significant part of her story, what she did with her grief. She did not simply endure. She acted. She understood that the greatest tribute to her husband would be to continue his work. In 1968, just months after his death, she joined with his friends and former staffers to found the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, which would later evolve into the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. This was not a passive memorial. It became her life's mission. The organization was created to advance the causes Bobby had championed: civil rights, social justice, and human rights around the world. Each year, the RFK Human Rights Award is given to activists, journalists, and leaders who, often at great personal risk, fight for freedom and justice in their home countries. For over 50 years, Ethel presided over these awards. She was not just a figurehead. She traveled the world, meeting with dissidents in Soviet-era Russia, standing with anti-apartheid activists like Desmond Tutu in South Africa, and lending the power of her husband's name to those who had no voice. One little-known story perfectly captures this quiet dedication. In 1986, the renowned Soviet dissident and political prisoner Natan Sharansky was finally released from the Gulag. One of the first things he did upon reaching freedom was to place a phone call. He called Ethel Kennedy. He told her that during his years of brutal imprisonment, the news that he had been given the RFK Human Rights Award in absentia was a profound source of hope, a signal that the world had not forgotten him. Ethel had personally championed his cause. This was her work. She transformed her private, unimaginable loss into a global force for good. She kept the flame of her husband's ideals burning not as a nostalgic memory, but as an active living force in the world. This is her ultimate significance. While Jackie Kennedy Onassis became a global icon of glamour, grace, and survival through reinvention, Ethel Kennedy became a symbol of survival through continuation. She did not seek a new life or a new identity. She dedicated herself to preserving the one she had shared with Bobby and to raising their 11 children to understand their father's legacy of service. And by that measure, she succeeded magnificently. Many of her children and dozens of her grandchildren have dedicated their lives to public service, environmentalism, and advocacy, a direct continuation of the work started by their father and so diligently nurtured by their mother. She wasn't just the keeper of the flame, she was the one who fanned it, making sure its light passed to a new generation. In the end, what is the measure of a life like Ethel Kennedy's? She lived for 96 years, a life that spanned the roaring 20s and the digital age, a life bookended by immense hope and immense sorrow. She experienced the highest peaks of political power and the deepest, most desolate valleys of personal grief. She was a woman of profound contradictions, fiercely competitive yet deeply faithful, the life of the party, yet an intensely private person, a mother whose love was both her children's greatest strength and, at times, a source of their most profound struggles. Her life was not a fairy tale. It was a testament to the fact that resilience isn't about avoiding pain. It's about what you choose to do with it. It's about choosing to keep the music playing, to keep the games going, to keep the family together even when your heart is broken into a million pieces. It's about getting up every single day and putting one foot in front of the other, guided by a stubborn faith and an absolute refusal to let tragedy have the last word. A friend once said of her, "Ethel has two speeds, full speed ahead and stop." For nearly a century, through unimaginable loss and against the tides of history, she chose full speed ahead. She kept her husband's promise alive, not by speaking of it, but by living it. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy not of what was lost, but of what, against all odds, managed to endure. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.